Hey everyone, Delve here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm going to cover the stat Faith in Dark Souls 3, which is a highly interesting stat. It's not especially strong throughout the series, but it is a unique stat with interesting properties. So we'll start with the upsides, the main obvious one being the offensive miracles. To be blunt, these are on the main less effective than sorceries or pyromancies. You have a small range of ranged miracles, which are generally okay, but usually don't do that much damage. You also have a small range of melee miracles, which are decently impressive but still underwhelming. The damage from them is fine, but the long casting times makes them on the main less useful than quicker weapons. Not to mention, of course, you have to deal with mana, so they're fine in some niche scenarios, but not your best option for Faith in my opinion. Next up are the support miracles, things like healing spells and other buffs. These vary wildly, with the healing spells not being that useful in my opinion. They are okay though, since you can essentially convert your mana bar into an extra Estus or two. There are also heal over time spells, which are roughly similar. Maybe these could be used to offset the damage from poison and other things like that. So they are potentially alright. The real star of the show here are the buff spells with other effects, stuff like damage and defensive bonuses. These are arguably the best use of miracles in general, and are great options even for characters who aren't built around Faith, so it's not necessarily a bad idea to consider Faith on just about any character for these reasons. And lastly, of course, we have the Infusions, faith-scaling weapons, and weapon buffs. Just like Intelligence, Faith has two infusions associated with it, Blessed and Lightning. To be honest, I think these are terrible, if not the worst infusions in the entire game. Blessed is interesting because it gives you a small amount of HP regen as long as the weapon or shield is equipped, and it gives faith scaling. The problem is the damage. While it does grant faith scaling as bonus physical damage, it also reduces the weapon's base damage considerably, essentially making it useless for damage. If that weren't enough, a blessed weapon can't even be buffed, so it's completely dead weight for weapons. You could apply it onto a shield just for the health regen, but the blessed gems are also quite rare, even rarer than simple gems, so I do think it's the worst infusion type in the entire game. Lightning is maybe a little better, but it has the exact same problem in that it cannot be buffed. So even though these infusions are in theory really strong on a small selection of weapons, the sad reality is they have a distinct counter synergy with the best part about Faith, which is weapon buffs. So onto the faith scaling weapons, of which there are a decent number. Unlike Intelligence, some of these weapons are able to be buffed with spells, making them somewhat useful. Also unlike Intelligence, Faith has access to a handful of weapons which come with lightning damage and can still be buffed, which is an extremely strong combination of traits. Weapon buff spells like Lightning Blade suddenly become extremely effective because of this, even on characters with low strength or dexterity. Unfortunately, there simply aren't that many weapons in the game with these good traits, but because these weapons exist at all, Faith actually has a way to deal significant damage to enemies and bosses, making it better than Intelligence in my opinion. In the DLC, the split damage of these weapons does catch up to you a little bit, but it's still a solid and enjoyable strategy. On to the downsides, and the first one ties into the buffable weapons with lightning damage or faith scaling. All told, there are extremely few options for this: one spear, one axe, one ultra greatsword, one straight sword, and one greatsword. Of these, 3 of them have innate lightning damage, and the other 2 only have faith scaling and physical damage, making them less useful when buffed with Lightning Blade. Now, to be clear, all of these weapons are fine, just because they can be buffed at all. But those are your only options, assuming you're not interested in using raw infused weapons. There is also one dagger which can be buffed with Dark Blade, and that's decent as well, but it's not as generically useful as the lightning weapons in my opinion. On top of these options, many of them aren't even obtainable in the first half of the game, so you have a good chunk of the game to get through before it even really all comes together. The next downside is the same as it is with Intelligence, and that is that your character is going to be spread a little thin. You're obviously incentivized to put points into attunement and dexterity, and because miracles start weak, you are also incentivized to consider strength. And this is all, of course, in addition to the points you'd ideally wish to put into stats like HP, stamina, and equip load. So for a faith character, I do recommend leaning into the strength and dexterity to start, and that's the only way you're going to be able to get through the game barring a fire-infused weapon. You want to meet the stat requirements for the key weapons anyway, when you do find them. There's one last downside to faith, that being covenants. Unfortunately, several interesting and potentially useful miracles are only obtainable by either doing PvP or co-op, or grinding certain enemies throughout the game who drop the covenant specific items. most of these aren't that useful, even if you could get your hands on them easily. But it's still worth mentioning, as they are interesting options if nothing else, and you simply don't have access to them without a bunch of grinding. Furthermore, many of the crucial and interesting items associated with Faith can be missed if you aren't careful, so you'll want to pay special attention to many of the NPC quest lines, as you could otherwise miss out on some of the best items for a Faith character. And that's really all it comes down to in terms of advantages and disadvantages. Faith ends up being a solid if gimmicky stat, although unimpressive at the beginning and end of the game. For your starting class, the obvious choice here is Cleric. Starting with a mace is nice, and the Force Miracle is actually quite useful, as it's one of the few ways in the whole game to knock enemies down. Your other option is Herald, which starts with a really weak healing miracle. Getting your hands on the Force Miracle will be a while, and it may or may not be that useful after the beginning of the game. My recommendation for the early part of the game is to essentially play as another kind of character, as it will be a while before Faith comes online. So you'll very much want to consider investing your early stats into health, strength, and dexterity. I recommend a solid workhorse weapon such as a longsword or mace for the first 5 or so bosses. You may also want to consider a weapon infused with fire. Before we talk about the Miracle Trainer, I do highly recommend rescuing Yoel of Londor and following his questline, at least until Yuria appears, as she can provide you with a Dark Miracle Tome. The Miracle Trainer is Irina of Karim, who can be rescued in the Undead Settlement. Just like the other spellcasting trainers, she can be given special books which enable her to teach you more miracles. However, it is crucial to note that giving her a Dark Miracle book, and then subsequently buying any of those Dark Miracles, will give you the bad ending of her questline, which could interfere with your ability to buy other miracles from her. The 2 Dark Miracle Tomes can instead be given to Carla, who can be rescued in the Irithyll dungeon, although you must try to give her the Dark Miracle Tomes twice. This can of course be used to get access to those Dark Miracles early, but you should strongly consider not buying them all from her if you do this, as buying them all will also lock you out of buying any remaining Light Miracles that you haven't already bought. Nearby to where you rescue Irina is the Saint's Talisman. This is the second best Light Miracle casting item in the game, and you can even use the special ability to make it harder to stagger you out of a miracle cast, so I recommend upgrading and using this Miracle Catalyst. The first Light Miracle Tome, the Braille Tome of Karim, can be found in the first part of the Road of Sacrifices, and the key spell that it contains is Tears of Denial. This is almost certainly one of the best miracles in the game, as it allows you to survive a single killing blow. It has a high mana cost, and it requires 2 attunement slots, but it also seems to have an endless duration, as long as you don't teleport. So it's quite easy to apply the buff and then simply rest at a bonfire to restore your mana. Also here is Morn's Ring, which boosts the damage of miracles, and you may also want to grab the Sage's Ring. Once you've got Yuria in Firelink Shrine, she can sell you the Londor Divine Braille Tome. This gives you access to Dark Blade, which allows you to buff a weapon and apply dark damage onto it. This is the first obtainable buff spell if you give the tome to Irina. Just like Intelligence, you may also want to head to Farron Keep early, as there is an interesting miracle here. It's near the Crystal Lizard with the large Titanite shards. Lightning Spear can be best compared to a throwing knife, as it deals low damage but casts very quickly. Unfortunately, it isn't even that mana efficient, so I don't recommend trying to use it for damage. While you are here in Farron Keep, you may want to obtain the Dream Chaser's Ashes, as you will very much want to be following Sirius's questline. The Cathedral of the Deep has 2 interesting things of note. The first is the Deep Braille Tome, which can be obtained by killing a mimic after the area where you first encounter the giant. Gnaw is an okay offensive miracle, as it also applies bleed damage, but you'll get a stronger version of it later. The other one is Deep Protection, which is a really interesting miracle. Unfortunately, it overrides Tears of Denial when used. If it lasted forever, like Tears of Denial, I would say it was worth considering, but because it only lasts 60 seconds, I'd say it's mostly worse. Still one of your more interesting options if you want extra damage. The other interesting thing here is the Pilgrim's Bident, which is a spear which organically scales with faith. This is actually a pretty bad weapon, as it's a spear and it's also quite heavy. Even with really high faith, a raw infusion will outdamage the scaling. It's worth mentioning because this is how the few faith scaling options go, but it can also be buffed. Oh yeah, and also while you're here in the Cathedral of the Deep, I do recommend following Siegvard's quest line. Your next area of interest is Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. There's one exceptionally crucial item here, and that being the Dragon Slayer Axe. If you want this weapon, make sure you get your hands on it before you kill Pontiff Sylvain, as you will not be able to obtain it after killing him. It can be obtained by following Sirius's questline, and then fighting the Kraton the Wanderer invasion after the third bonfire. Read up on how this questline works, and make sure you are following it, because it is fairly complex. This is arguably the most important item in the entire run for a Faith character, as it comes with lightning damage, but can also be buffed with weapon buff spells. Lightning damage doesn't scale with Faith, but the damage is quite high anyway, and the attack speed is decently quick, so it's easily the best weapon to buff with Lightning Blade. Now, you could infuse a weapon with either Lightning or Blessed, which would grant the weapon Faith scaling on the lightning damage, and that of course would prevent the weapon from being buffed, so the best infusion for it would be Raw. There's a few more relevant items here in Irithyll. Firstly, we have Siegward of Katarina. If you've been following his questline up until this point, he will give you the miracle Emit Force, which is a fairly decent miracle all things considered. It does high poise damage, is mana efficient, and deals alright physical damage. It has a fairly slow cast speed, but I still use it against the old Demon King to great effect. The next item of note here is the Ring of the Sun's Firstborn, which can be found by dropping off a ledge right in front of the Pontiff Sylvain boss room. This ring simply boosts your miracle damage. And lastly, we have Doris's Gnawing, which is an improved version of Gnaw. This spell deals dark damage, has a slow projectile speed, and also applies a decent amount of bleed damage. It's certainly not a bad spell at all, although I'm not sure that it's all that practical compared to the other things that Faith can do. Supposedly, it's really great against the Demon Prince boss later, though. One last thing to mention is the Lothric Knight Greatsword, which can be bought from Greyrat after he gets back from his second thieving mission. Your next location is the Irithyll Dungeon, so if you want this weapon, make sure you know how to obtain it before moving on. This is another weapon that has innate lightning damage and can also be buffed, sort of like the Dragonslayer Axe. This is in theory a good weapon against most enemies, but there are a lot of subtle problems with it. It has high stat requirements and is also very heavy, which is really bad for a spellcaster character who is already spread thin in terms of their stats. It is also a slow weapon, making it a worse option than the Dragonslayer Axe against bosses. It's still not a bad weapon, but its subtle problems make it less than ideal for a faith-oriented character in my opinion. Now next up is Irithyll Dungeon, and here's where things really get started, because on the elevator shortcut near the path to Archdragon Peak is the spell Lightning Blade. Note that this spell has a faith requirement of 30. This is where faith really starts to pay off, especially with a buffed Dragonslayer Axe. This is probably more or less the best way to deal damage for the remainder of the game, with the exception of bosses resistant to lightning. One crucial thing to note about spell buffs in general, that being that the miracle boosting rings do not affect the damage of spell buffs, so in this case, Morn's Ring and Ring of the Sun's Firstborn. For sorcery and pyromancy weapon buffs, this is also the case with their respective spell boosting rings as well. The elemental clutch rings do affect the damage of weapon buffs for their corresponding element, however. I also recommend considering Lingering Dragoncrest Ring, which increases the duration of weapon buff spells as well. Speaking of the clutch rings, you may want to grab the Dark Clutch Ring while you are here in the Irithyll Dungeon, as it may come in handy later. The best catalyst in the game is Yorshka's Chime, which can be obtained by killing Yorshka in Anor Londo. It's only slightly better than the Saint's Talisman, so it's really not even necessary to obtain, and obtaining it will anger Sirius of the Sunless Realms, so make sure you don't need anything else from her before you obtain it. Now I'll talk briefly about offensive miracles, since you can obtain two relevant ones around this point. The first is Wrath of the Gods, which can be found in the Profane Capital. This is an interesting spell because it does deal decent damage. Sadly, it is not only melee range, but it also has a slow cast speed, making it not as useful as the Dark Souls 1 version. Another one is Lifehunt Scythe, which can be obtained by trading in the Soul of Aldrich. This is another spell that deals decent damage, but again, its cast speed is a little on the slow side, so I don't really care for it. Neither of these are unusable, but I don't think they're better options than buffing the Dragonslayer Axe with Lightning Blade. Next up is Lothric Castle, which has two relevant items. The first is the Lothric Divine Braille Tome. The main miracle of interest is Blessed Weapon, which increases the physical damage of your weapons by a flat 7.5%. In practice, this will rarely outperform Lightning Blade on any weapon, but it does come with some health regen, and it also has a very low faith requirement of 15, making it an interesting option for a strength or dexterity build. Next up is the Sunlight Straightsword, which can be obtained by killing the Mimic near the Lothric Divine Tome. This is a faith scaling weapon which deals exclusively physical damage. It attacks decently quickly, and its special ability is also a self buff, which is nice. Unfortunately, the actual damage that it deals, even with high faith, is fairly poor. That being said, it does upgrade with Twinkling Titanite, which is otherwise kind of useless, so I used it with Blessed Weapon to kill Dragon Slayer Armor, who is resistant to both lightning and dark. You can also kill Oseros at this point, at which point you can get the Lightning Clutch Ring, which is found right before the Ancient Wyvern boss arena. Okay, so many of the remaining bosses are resistant to lightning, including the DLC bosses. For the Nameless King and the Soul of Cinder, I recommend heading to the Drag Heap and grabbing the Murky Hand Scythe. You could hypothetically get this weapon early by killing Sister Frida. This weapon has innate dark damage and can be further buffed using the Dark Blade Miracle from Irina or Carla. This is essentially your only option against these two bosses, unless you feel like trying to use Offensive Miracles or Blessed Weapon, which I don't recommend. Soul of Cinder's soul can be traded in for the Sunlight Spear, which is probably the best defensive miracle in the game. Unfortunately, I don't think it's any good against the DLC bosses, who are generally quite resistant to spells. For Demon Prince, Half-Light, and Gale, you unfortunately don't really have any better options though, although supposedly I have heard that Demon Prince is in fact weak to dark, so you could consider trying Doris's Gnawing. Midir, however, is so insanely resistant to elemental damage that I actually used the Saint's Bident buffed with Blessed Weapon alongside the Leo Ring. You could also just easily use a raw infused thrust weapon of any kind, buffed with Blessed Weapon. That would probably also work just fine. For Gale, I didn't really have a choice but Dragon Slayer's Axe, buffed with Lightning Blade. Okay, and now onto your character build. You're going to want to start out by considering decent melee stats, such as Strength or Dexterity, as you will need these for the first half of the game. I used a longsword, and I ended up getting my Strength and Dexterity each to at least 15 at some point. Another crucial thing I recommend for these caster-oriented characters is to put some points into HP, especially early. You actually gain a considerable amount of HP per point of Vigor, and so I also recommend getting that stat into the 15 to 20 range pretty quickly. From there, the obvious thing is just to pump Faith, and you'll really want at least 30 by the time you hit Irithyll Dungeon. I brought it all the way to 60 from there, but you could also consider putting points into other stats as well. For your rings, the obvious caster options apply when using miracles. Morn's Ring, Ring of the Sun's Firstborn, and Sage's Ring are all great options, alongside Lightning and Dark Clutch Ring. If you're using weapon buffs, I mostly just recommend the Clutch Rings and Lingering Dragon Crest Ring. And of course, all the standard good rings apply here. Estus Ring, Ring of Steel Protection, Chloranthy Ring, and Covetous Gold and Silver Rings are all great rings. Okay, and that's the Dark Souls 3 Faith Guide. I do appreciate very much that this is a very unique stat, unlike other stats in the game. Like Intelligence, unfortunately, it takes a while for it to get going, and it's not even especially good at the end of the game, but it does excel for a good number of bosses in the middle of the game, so it's a fairly fun stat to use. Thanks for watching.